Jordan, that's my fault. Sometimes when I click back to full screen, it hits recording pause. So try not to do that.
No.
Okay, yeah, I think we're rolling.
Yeah. Afternoon, everybody. I'm sure Jay will be right along to get us started. Heads up, if you haven't seen it yet, I just sent folks on this call kind of a last minute email. It just has some other language options for our discussion about 193E2. This, our agenda has some suggested language on it. Iris offered a tweaking to that. Bill Ardinger offered a more comprehensive alternative to all of the relevant language in 193E.
I just got your email, Bruce.
Yeah, so
there's no way I can absorb and discuss Bill's comments today. They're very extensive.
yeah, maybe we can walk through them. Unfortunately, Bill.
Well, I mean, I can't see them at the same time that I'm talking to you all, and I can't get to my printer, so I'm stuck.
Sure,
but it's really
share.
a comprehensive approach that bears some thought before we get into it. I can't do it 2 minutes before.
Yeah, no doubt. And we're going to pause actually and give people a few minutes to at least skim them, and then we can share the screen and walk through it if that's where Jay wants to go.
Yeah, and Bruce, I just did some word checking on Iris's piece and sent it to you.
Oh, okay.
So when we get there, we can bring that up. Yeah,
well, we can start. I mean, Jay, we could start with the draft language that's on the agenda, and then Iris's suggestions, and then have that as the basis for then later on looking at Bill's more comprehensive.
Yeah, and what's included in his that wasn't included for our review yet, right? Particularly highlighting that. Yeah. Right. So.
Not saying your email.
No, I didn't send it everywhere. I just sent it to Bruce so that he could put it up on the screen.
And I'm in the process of doing that. So
anyway, let me call this meeting order. We'll start with a roll call of the workforce. Adequacy and distribution work group. Thank you all for making time today. And if anybody is having some trouble viewing this, please consult the phone number in the announcement of the meeting and communicate of your difficulties. So beginning with just read across my screen on roll call of the membership, Val Zanchuk.
Val Zanchuk is here in Falmouth on a bit of a vacation, currently communicating via phone. I will be back on my computer in a few minutes.
Thanks for, actually you are visible.
Oh, okay.
And I should have added that Jay Kahn, I'm in Keene, in an office by myself at the moment. Let's see, other members of the committee, Barbara Tremblay.
Barbara Tremblay here in Keene. My husband's in the other room. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Barbara. Val, I should have said, and thanks for taking time out of your vacation. Iris?
Hi, everybody, at home in Barrington.
Thank you. And Jane?
Good afternoon, everyone. Jane Bergeron. I'm here at my home in Litchfield, New Hampshire, with my black lab Otis.
Thanks, Jane. We did get word from Bill Ardinger. He's unable to join us. He did send some comments in advance, so at an appropriate time, we'll at least compare some of his thoughts of what other kinds of tweaks can be added. Let's see, other members of the commission who are present on the call. I see Rick Ladd.
Good afternoon. Rick Ladd is present in Haverhill. 2 grandkids that are homeschooling are moving back and forth.
All right. David?
Thanks, Jay. Dave Luno here in Hopkinton with Ozzy, the long-haired dachshund.
Yeah, he's got to make an appearance someday, you know.
Well, I'll get him on. Yeah.
Dick?
Yeah, Dick Ames. I'm here in Jaffrey in my office alone.
Thanks, Dick. And Mel?
Mel Myler, calling from Port Clyde, Maine.
Thank you, Mel. And Carsey staff on the call? Bruce?
Yeah, Bruce Mallory in Kittery Point, Maine, at home in my home office alone.
And Jordan?
Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance is in the other room.
All right. All right, so we are all present. We have on our agenda today, if I get the right agenda.
Jay, while you're doing that, let me make a comment because I've received a question about how folks that are attending this meeting and listening in can also have access to the documents that are being shared, have just recently been shared. Good question. And remind me, Jordan, here's my ignorance. Folks that are calling in can also see what's on the screen. Is that correct?
Folks on the Zoom call, so if you're attending via your phone or tablet or computer and can see a screen, then yes, they can see the screen. But if you're just listening, like on a normal phone, obviously you can't.
So we'll use screen share when we refer to any documents other than what's already been distributed, which would be the agenda. But we do have some other responses, suggested wording that have come from commission members, and we'll use screen share for now. And of course, post all of those in the minutes of the meeting as we go too.
So Bruce, will the documents, for example, the draft comparison of Mass and New Hampshire, be on our website for today's meeting?
Well, that wasn't slated to be discussed, and without Bill being here, we probably shouldn't dive into that. That's my view. Jay,
Okay.
Different view.
That's not an error, so one of the things that came out of our last group meeting, full commission meeting, and folks, as I frame this, please let me know that I'm doing this correctly, is that we were reviewing an outcomes-based model for estimation of costs. And the statement that it's our intention to use that approach as a basis for costing education would be that this committee, that the full commission wanted this committee to make that recommendation. So I want to begin with just a general question before we dive into, and so what would the changes need to be made, that there is a comfort level with the members of this work group to use that outcomes-based methodology for determining the cost of the opportunity for an adequate education. Putting that forward in with others, the recollection that David and Bruce have for that?
Yeah, and this was a discussion, we began this discussion in the last full commission meeting. And some folks had concerns about how the weights were derived and what factors are included in the differential aid portions of what AIR was proposing. So we had that discussion at the last commission meeting. I think this basically comes back to this work group to bring forward a recommendation to the full commission to not necessarily accept AIR's calculations or the examples they gave at the end of the AIR report about revenue models, but at a conceptual level to endorse the idea that the definition of an adequate education and the costing of that adequate education be based on student performance or student outcomes, statewide averages, as evidenced by achievement tests, graduation rates, and attendance rates. So really, I think we're looking for a conceptual endorsement of that approach, which is obviously different from existing statutes. Then what the precise language is that needs to go into the statutes is probably a second step. And we can begin that part of the conversation today, but we may not, land on a consensus for that language.
And Bruce, I don't believe, well, I want to hear from David as well. David, you feel like that's framing it correctly?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, we've been at this for quite a while with the AIR team, and looking at an outcome-based approach for estimating the costs to educate students in each district across the state based on their ability to, or their opportunity, I shouldn't say ability, I think opportunity. Rick brings this up all the time, and it's absolutely true that it's the opportunity for equitable outcomes or normal outcomes or however you want to state it. But yeah, I mean, I think, we've said from the beginning, we're really operating this commission based on consensus to move forward. And we've been moving forward under this basis with outcome-driven approach for at least the last several months. And if there's somebody that feels no, we need to really be sticking with input-driven approach, then I think we need to understand what's happened and why somebody feels that way. What Bruce said, I think, is right on. That you don't. It's not about necessarily endorsing the weights or things. We still, I think, got some questions and answers to get through to understand that. But we've talked about several times. Step one gets us to the estimated costs in the first year, based on a total dig out of all a mining of the DOE 25s for the 10 preceding years from every district in the state. And so that gives us the estimated cost to receive normal outcomes across all districts. Now, without having to drill down into DOE 25s every year, in order to understand that, how do we model that going forward? And that's where the model comes in with the weights, so that you can do it 5 years from now, 8 years from now, 10 years from now. At some point, that model wears out because you can't operate at open loop forever, and you need to recalibrate. But I think I think understanding that how that first step is done, I hope we're pretty close to that.
So we accepted in the last full commission meeting, we accepted the report. And we accepted the outcome. Did we accept the outcome? No.
All we did when that motion at the last meeting was accept the report and confirm that AIR had met its contractual obligations for the 5 deliverables described in the contract between the commission and AIR. I don't believe that was meant to imply that there was unanimous agreement about every recommendation or finding or example or word.
Right. Right. And so I think what we are confirming for back to the executive team and Bruce is that as the next meeting, we come forward with that recommendation that the education cost model will use a outcome-based approach, and we'll work on that wording. But is there any hesitation from this work group membership to come forward with that? And I think that was the ask of the from the last meeting. So I think
Iris is raised.
Iris, please.
Yeah, I have to say something. Although I was hoping to hear from other members of the committee, but I'm still not totally comfortable with it because I still don't totally understand it. And, you know, to say that I'm embracing an outcome method without understanding how that translates into the policy, I don't know. I mean, I offered suggestions in wording because, I mean, in some sense, I felt like the train had left the station and this is where we were going. And I'm not really opposed to it. I'm just not sold on it yet. And I'm also not completely satisfied in my mind that an inputs-based approach that could have been beefed up in many ways wouldn't also fit the bill. So I don't know that I'm ready to completely endorse the leap, but if the leap's gonna be made, I want it to be made as best as possible. And that's where my suggestions were coming from.
Understood. Yeah, Val?
Yeah, I continue to have a difficulty reconciling the old way and the new way in this because everyone is so familiar with the input model. To go 100% output, which is effectively sort of a black box because we're using this, you know, regression analysis, is a huge leap of faith in one respect, but in the other respect, the outcome analysis that was done by AIR, I think reasonably supports the inputs that were developed in all of our statutes about what should be taught to create, you know, the well-rounded graduate. And I think the analysis says, okay, in general, those inputs did create the output that they were, you know, we were hoping for years ago. It's a way of affirming that, okay, the input was a reasonable attempt to define a method. And now years in the future, we're looking at the outcomes and saying, okay, you know, they worked out pretty well. We spend $3.2 billion and we're, you know, top 10 ranking. So I guess it works. So I think there's value in the outcome affirming that the inputs were reasonable. And it's a way of checking the whole process. The other difficulty I have is that, and I think this is one that Iris has expressed as well, is the AIR number, the adequacy number is, you know, $19,000 a year, the state's obligation in this. And if we say, well, no, we think it's something less than that, to me, there's no way in that outcome equation that you can carve out what aspect of it relates to the state's, you know, constitutional obligation. Whereas the input system created that, but I think the input system was horribly flawed because, as some of the Supreme Court justices commented the other day, common sense would indicate you can't provide adequacy with, $3,700. I think that whole argument is dead and will be shown to be dead when the Supreme Court comes out with its ruling. So I think we need to recognize that something more than that is going to be there. And as I mentioned to Jay earlier today, I ran some numbers, went back into the ARR simulator, and basically I put the old swept 63 in, and sure enough, when I did that and ran all the numbers, the state's obligation for adequacy was about $10,000, which is what Conval is arguing. So maybe it's just by chance that it all came out that way, but there's way of testing a couple of different assumptions and getting some convergence on a number that is based not only on the output analysis, but on the inputs that are in statute.
You found the consistency.
Yeah.
I tried to find what I call the Rosetta Stone, what ties one to the other, so that people who are used to one way of thinking can see how the two come together. Otherwise, it's such a disparity. It's like, two different islands 1,000 miles apart. And yeah, they both have coconuts, but boy, you really don't know how they're related. And this way, I think, provides a bridge. And I think we need to provide that bridge so that when the legislature and the governor, everyone else looks at this, they can say, okay, we can see how what we did relates to what's there and where the discrepancies are and how we should redistribute funding and whatever to make it so that the output for everybody is the same and not just the average.
And relative to, so that sounds supportive of an outcomes-based approach, that we produce a model that leads to comparable outcomes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Barbara?
Okay, Jay, I was just as Val. I did the same thing. I took the sweat money and did some and went through. I see Jane nodding her head, and went through and did the same thing and came out with the input and the output. Some very interesting things coming together there. And then listening to the case the other day, a lot of things came to mind in how we would even present such a thing. It needs to be very clearly defined, and how we arrived at whatever, if we decide to do the outcomes-based. The other thing that came to mind is, as I was listening to the case, is the Winchester School District, which stated that they did not need to add any more money to their budget because the outcomes of their students was so high. So we need to be very clear when we talk about outcomes, what we mean, just as we did with the inputs. What does that mean? So that is one piece. The other thing I want to make sure we include is the word opportunities for an adequate education. I think that word has been missing until our work, and I think that's a very important word that needs to be in whatever we have for a final piece. The opportunity for an adequate education, or whatever we determine. Yeah. Is very different than an adequate education. So, my 2 cents.
Yeah, and you're right about how they're used interchangeably in our statutes, and agreed.
So Jay?
Yes, David.
It also might be worth noting what we and you were there for the meeting, what was discussed this morning in fiscal policy with respect to first last dollar.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what it would. Go ahead. You got a train of thought there.
Well, sure. Well, I'm happy to hand it over to you on this, but I think what we talked about in fiscal policy this morning was not to take a hard line on what New Hampshire's constitutional requirement is for funding the cost of an opportunity for an adequate education. And the reason for that is because taking a hard line on it could drive us in certain directions in terms of how we go about costing what that is, because it could very much, tighten up affect the fiscal policy going on. So I think being able to have some flexibility in terms of how to look at what the state's requirement is, provides us a little more flexibility in terms of what the estimated cost model.
I think you need to be more specific than to say not take a hard line. I mean, I think what you're saying is that you're rejecting those who interpret the court's ruling to mean first and last dollar.
Well, when one of the things that came up this morning was perhaps a court opinion may have been different under a different set of context here in New Hampshire. Had we actually said that the cost of an adequate education was more like the cost of an adequate education as opposed to $3,700, we might have gotten a different result from the court. But instead, the cost of an adequate education as laid out by the legislature was $3,700. So they said, well, you better pay for all of it. So I think we want to have a little more flexibility in terms of.
Sorry, but that's backwards. The Londonderry decision came before the funding. But I'm not debating whether you should or shouldn't. All I'm saying is I want to understand clearly, and everyone needs to understand clearly what you mean by saying not take a hard line. And what you're describing is a rejection of that interpretation of that particular ruling in 06. And if that's what we mean, then let's say it.
Yeah. Personally, I think that we need to be prepared to take both approaches. When I hear the not take a hard line is let's not assume just one approach, first and last dollar, or a full disparity, but let's model both so that we can understand and policymakers can see that what the consequences, how you would need to approach a first and last dollar approach, and what you would need to do in order to approach an equalizing of the opportunity.
Well, I'd call that taking a look at both rather than not taking a hard line. And that just rings differently to me.
I'm happy to adopt your words on that, Iris.
And then it's more inclusive, makes people feel better. And then in terms of, what we're grappling with, inputs, outputs, I mean, it's sort of related to what I was saying at the very beginning of this discussion is, I still think there's some way that an input-based, improved input-based methodology may also result in more equity, but we haven't looked at that. So I don't know, that makes it a little hard to take a jump right to the outcome.
Yeah.
If I might just add a comment on this. We're going to, at the next full commission meeting next Monday, we're going to take a step back and remind ourselves of where we started in January and how we got to exactly this discussion that's happening right now. And part of that process involved putting out an RFP for research consultants with expertise in costing adequacy. We looked at the two proposals that we got. One offered what I'll call an input-based professional judgment option. Here in our professional judgment is what you need in order to achieve an adequate education. These kinds of teacher-student ratios, these kinds of classroom sizes, these kinds of teacher qualifications, you're familiar with those. The other bid that we got, response we got, provided this empirical evidence-based, how much does that actually cost to achieve an agreed upon set of outcomes? We discussed within the commission the pros and cons of those proposals, those two proposals, and we chose the AAR approach. So we kind of went down that path. And now I think, realistically, we're asking ourselves, what did we miss by not going the other way? And by not considering a more traditional professional judgment or input-based model. So the fact that we made that choice doesn't necessarily lock us in today in this conversation to making a particular choice, but that's how we got here. And I think that just, it's just a reminder that we didn't just make this up. We didn't stumble into this. It's been kind of a systematic process.
Val?
Yeah, well, I think the fact that all of our existing statutes and whatever are all based on input, I think it was reasonable to look at it output based. Again, going back to my trying to find the balance between the two and say, okay, we had all of these inputs in place. Let's measure how well we did with those and whether or not it makes sense. I think it's very difficult to go back, to go into the input side and say we need to tweak something one way or the other without sort of knowing what the outcome was of what we tweaked, X years ago. So it's I think it was useful to get that information because it helps give us sort of a continuum of, okay, what inputs resulted in what outputs. If we had an input-based system that had horrible output, we may have suggested to ourselves, well, maybe the inputs were wrong. But if anything, it sort of reaffirms that, okay, the inputs were reasonable, at least in terms of criteria, which classes should be taught, what subjects should be taught. I don't think it's a confirmation of the amount of money that the state decided upon for adequacy, because that's part of what the argument is right now, is that we have districts that can't afford to provide the outcome that the state wants with the adequacy funding that's in place without taxing people to death. So I think it does give us a stronger, sort of more holistic view of the whole situation, allowing us to look at both sides and offer alternatives to how do we get there and what's the state's obligation. There are boundaries now that I think make it less of an open-ended or wishful thinking situation. We now have cause and effect, and we can balance that out, I think, much more effectively when we just had cause and not knowing what the effect was. So I think had we gone the input-based side, we would still be in a situation not knowing whether or not the outcomes were successful. By going to the output side, we now can measure what we suggested as a state years ago of what the input should be, and indeed the outcomes are quite good. So we don't need to necessarily tweak one to affect the other. We know what the relationship is reasonably well.
Right. One of the things that becomes clearer for us is that if the state can move to disparity aid as a basis for distributing, then the outcomes-based model is in fact really supportive of that. I mean, you wouldn't use an input-based model to address disparities. You need the weights. You need to understand student needs and how to equalize those opportunities. So there is a certain path that links up, and I think you're saying too that we know the input-based model that leads to the first and last dollar approach just has yielded unrealistic results. And so maybe we can move to something more realistic through this outcome-based approach.
I want to make a clarifying comment quickly too. I'm trying not to, obviously I don't have a position on the question that's on the table, but in terms of clarity, it strikes me that actually there are two different kinds of inputs that the system has been operating with. One is a set of cost inputs that the department has identified we're familiar with those. The cost of a principal, a technology expert, the average teacher salary, class sizes, some transportation, et cetera. So those are the cost inputs that goes into running a building. The statutes also list a set of inputs for the student, like, what are the content areas that all students need to be exposed to in order to achieve adequacy, or in the constitutional language, become whatever it is, productive, responsible citizens contributing to the economy, et cetera. So there are these cost inputs, but there are also student inputs. And I think that whatever action the commission takes, and in this conversation, we don't need to throw out all the bathwater. That list of content areas, at least to my observation, strikes me as still quite relevant. It's a guide for what schools need to focus on to produce that productive, informed citizen. Where the shift is taking place here that we're talking about is how to determine the cost of providing those inputs, those curriculum inputs to the student to achieve a statewide average. I hope that's helpful.
Right, and the analysis that I did over the weekend, basically said that the cost input side, as redefined in the Conval suit, which was an attempt to update the cost inputs, came out with about the same number had we not changed the original intent and level of the swept rate, and it's 6.63. If that had actually been enacted and kept through the years, the state's contribution would be at about the same level that Conval says the state should be paying. So, I think the outcome is telling us that the content portion of the input was good. It's also telling us that the cost part of it isn't good, and it's creating disparities that are affecting not only the taxpayers, but the students. And we should be suggesting ways to change those. We're not telling the schools or the DOE they should teach different things. We're just saying, guys, the way we're trying to pay for it isn't working. And it's hurting people from a tax standpoint, and it's hurting the students from their outcome standpoint. And I think that's the real power of the output analysis and the simulator, is the ability to see what changes can be made and what impact they will have, given that the model is showing there's a reasonably strong correlation between some factors like free and reduced lunch and English second language and all those sorts of things that affect that outcome. And I think, the arguments that were made this morning in the note from the selectmen saying, there's nothing that shows as taking money from rich districts and putting them in the poor districts is going to have an impact. I think the outcome analysis says, yeah, it does have an impact. If these districts were able to spend at the level of others, their students would probably be doing much better. So, again, I think it's the output gave us some quantitative input to our discussion here that proves, or very strongly suggests, that there is a relationship between how much is being spent and the outcome of the students in their achievement.
Right, and the AIR report very clearly demonstrates with a high correlation north of 0.7, I think, that relationship between average student costs and the outcomes. The other thing we got to keep in mind too is that the $3.1 billion that all in New Hampshire is spent on education. That's not buying outcomes. That's buying inputs, and that gets you the outcomes. And I think this is what Val's point was really earlier. The inputs lead to the outcomes, and the other thing too that I think is really important from the AIR report is that it's not $19,000 per student. That's just an average, or whatever it is, 18,000, whatever it came out to be. That's just an average. It's a very specific estimated cost by district to achieve those normalized or normal state average outcome. And you know, in some cases it's $15,000, in other cases it's $21,000, $22,000, given the unique characteristics that every district has.
Right. Dick?
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of things just on that last note from Dave. As I understand it, Massachusetts per pupil foundation budget cost is about $11,500. And we're talking here, and I take Dave's point about averages, but still we're talking here, when people look at this state, at a proposed funding cost per student of, I don't know, $18,000, roughly. That's a big jump. So are we comfortable with that? And then I wanted to ask this question of Val, really, or the rest of you. Maybe I just don't understand. If the commission said that it agreed with it as adopting the output-based formulation that AR has worked through, Val, were you saying that it's sort of like a black box? There's no way to cut into that. So that's going to be our adequacy cost.
Well, I think if at least my understanding of the AR analysis was basically, here's the average, here's the amount of money spent on, by student, which came out to, the average, and that gave an adequate outcome. They said, if New Hampshire is among the highest spending states and getting among the highest outcome, then let's assume that that outcome for that input is adequate. I mean, I think that's what they're saying, but there's no way in looking at that to say, okay, what portion of the state's obligation it comes out of that? And that's easier to do if you're doing some sort of input method, as the current law is, because all it's saying is here's your number, and it's not saying whose responsibility it is for what portion of it. It's just saying that's the number. And that was my concern with the language, the draft language, is that the AIR model, again, to my understanding, is just telling us, okay, here's a number to get adequacy. And then we're saying to the legislature, well, you guys figure out what proportion of it belongs to the state. Well, that model does not give that kind of direction. So, you're creating a situation where you're going to have, 424 different opinions about what the state's obligation is in that, unless there's some sort of way of taking the thought process that people currently have with the current input-based thing, tying it to the adequacy number, to the AIR information, and trying to come up with something in between. I just don't see how you can take one number, and I think this was Iris's question several times too, is the AIR number the number for adequacy? And if we were to agree to that, then I think we'd have to say, well, then the state's obligation is $3.2 billion. And I don't think that's what we're saying or expecting to come to a conclusion on. But that model doesn't give you any mechanism for determining the balance between state and local funding. And
the
that's
simulator does have a place where you can go below or above the average.
Well, yes, it does.
I understand the meaning of that. But,
yeah,
maybe
right. So then, if we go above or below, that still doesn't say which portion of that number that comes out of that is the state's obligation. All it's doing is changing it. And then they have the ability to put in an arbitrary amount of money of, local funding. And they said, well, let's make it $5. well, how can we just throw that number in there and then say that's the equitable distribution between the state's obligation and the local community? I mean, I would say the current, $3,700 number, built up as it is with all the various assumptions, is not reflective of what it actually costs to provide the base amount of adequacy. I think the Conval, number, $9,900, whatever it was a much more realistic attempt to say, no, 30 to 1 student teacher is not realistic. It's 15 to 1, guys. And no, $32,000, this is the average salary, it's X. And no, I mean, they're having to live with this every day. So this is what they're spending to provide just the basics. And they broke down, okay, it's costing Conval 16 and 6 of it is stuff that's not adequacy focused, but 10 of it is. And they came up with a number. And if you take any of our if you take $3,700, which was a number fixed 12 years ago that hasn't changed in 12 years, and put a 4 or 5% growth rate on it, you get up to $6,500 or $6,800. Any of those numbers that are fixed that did not allow for an increase in cost just keeps making the state's position worse and worse, because they're giving a fixed amount of money to support a cost that's increasing every year. And unless the cost of education is flat, the state's obligation percentage of contribution just gets lower and lower and lower. And that was, to me, the fundamental flaw in that whole concept. If there was a mechanism in that $3,700 in 2008 that says it's going to increase by a consumer price index or something like that, there wouldn't be as much of a disparity between what the state's giving and what it's costing the districts if the state's contribution had been increasing. So now we're in a situation where instead of a gradual increase every year, you've got this step function that's probably facing us where the state has to come up with a big jump to meet some sort of number. So that's just my opinion.
Or
Respond to that.
yeah, sorry.
Well, I want to respond to that. There was a cost of living increase in the original legislation. It was just one of the things that got butchered out. And what else did I want to say?
Yeah,
I don't.
well, just like the 663 was.
Oh, I know what I wanted to say. The $3,700 number, or whatever it is, that keeps getting bandied around. I would like to remind people that I don't think there's a district that gets that amount per pupil, because that's before any weights are applied. And this outcome thing does the same thing, but ends up with a base of 5,000 or something. So, I don't think those animals are that different.
Yeah. And I guess I want to just add into two things. One is I think this black box notion is just undermines a lot of known results of our analyses, in that the analysis in the approach the commission has used to date ends up with the same variables being significant as found in 2008. So there's, again, back to the consistency. I think we've found that the error that we've got is in not valuing the weights appropriately. And so now we've got a basis for a reevaluation of what those weights ought to be. So I don't think that this is that mysterious. Unknown color. The second thought is that I think relative to the way in which this is addressed in a funding sense is that the state will continue to raise the same amount of money from non-property tax revenues as it already does. So that $670 million, that's a given that assumes, all right, so that's one of our assumptions. The remainder needs to be shared state and local responsibility. And where the dollars that the state would allocate would go in a direction that supports an equalizing of the opportunities. So I think I just put those two things out there because I think that's what this model is suggesting. It's suggesting both. I saw Rick's hand up.
Well,
So you look chomping at the bit.
Hey, you calling on me, Jay?
I am. And then
Thank
Bruce.
you very much. I've sort of listened, as I'm not really a member of this work group, but a member of the commission. And as I spoke with several of you this morning, you know my position on this, and it's kind of reflective in the discussion that Val and Iris have mentioned, that right now, if we're going to accept that our constitutional requirement to provide an adequate education or opportunity for an adequate education is done by taking the average of the aggregate of everything we're spending in the DOE 25 form, and to use that and not look at that sub-element or to de-aggregate that to find out what is adequacy in accordance with our Constitution. And Londonderry and Claremont, we have the responsibility, the legislature, to define adequate education. We have the constitutional requirement to establish the criteria that adds up to that adequate education. And we also have the constitutional responsibility to set the standards for the accountability of that adequate opportunity for an adequate education. What we have done, though, in the last 10 years, 12 years, or 10 years, since we had the Iris Estabrook formula, which had a whole lot more to it than we have now. We've stripped out the fiscal capacity disparity aid. We've eliminated the ability of communities to get some weighted support in terms of free and reduced support. We have utterly destroyed that formula and weakened it. So the inputs to me are not altogether bad, but there is also another statute that the 06-08 people put together, dealt with resource elements, and that's within an adequate public education. It says the general court recognizes that schools with greater educational challenges will benefit from varying resources. Schools with varying educational challenges often exist within a single school district. The general court is committed to addressing the varying educational challenges that exist among the schools of the state. We didn't even do that. We haven't been doing what they saw we needed to be doing. So I think we got to find some combination here between the inputs and the outputs, because I agree, we have inequities, we have disparities, and we need to have valid ways of measure, whether we do it by attendance or graduation rates or achievement/growth of a student. I think there's other good ways to assess where we are too. What the schools are doing now in terms of submitting these DOE 25 forms, and they're sending you all their costs. And within those costs, I picked on football, for example. You know, that's in that bundle as well. Is that an adequate education? Some might say, yes, I support athletics. Yeah, all my kids are at the collegiate level in them right now. However, I don't know if it's necessarily that core knowledge that's necessary for them to go off and work for Val in his manufacturing plant. So I think that we got to be very careful. There's some real wonderful aspects that, you know, AIR has provided us. I don't necessarily agree with the numbers, the way they all tally up, but the idea of weights is needed. And we need to really consider where we're going with the categorical grants, i.e. building aid, special education CAT aid, transportation. And I even throw in there, we need to start looking at how we're going to provide the high schools the needed support to provide those skills that used to be provided through the old vocational education, now technical education. Some of those things are not being taught in the CTE centers. They could very well be taught within the high schools and get the kids on a pathway for what we know we need to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. And I think, actually, I found in your words a transition back to our agenda. And I think it's worth going there, and I recognize there are various levels of comfort and interests in the outcome-based model. Personally, I find it the consistency of our thought process to try to aim to something that's more outcome-driven than input-driven gives us a basis for knowing if our inputs are really leading to equitable opportunity. Leaving that aside for the time being, because I think we all agree with that to different levels, maybe we can drill down on some of the words that begin to define this. And Bruce, maybe we can put up Iris's description, because I think what Iris, I heard you say earlier is that if we're using this basis for our distribution, that then our statutes need to match our intentions, and that's what you aimed at trying to bring consistency to, and I think that's where Bruce was trying to help us get there as well, right? So why don't we take a look at this? I'm getting my glasses.
Yeah, and I can explain where the changes that I made from your alternative language that you had proposed in the agenda. It's helpful to get things pointed out, probably. Basically, took out some verbiage in the alternative language that was proposed from for students to achieve through the word such that, and then came up with and then added the word educational before. Well, wait a minute, now I can't see it. Yeah. The alternative that I proposed didn't have the word educational before the word needs, and it didn't have the words physical capacity. So in that sense, I changed the end of the sentence and I deleted the middle of the sentence. And then in the second sentence that had been proposed, there was, first question was whether to use the word comparable or equitable. I just used target. And then I made the point that they may be weighted for individual students whose needs exceed those of the average student, but that there are also weights that don't apply to the individual needs of the average student, like the small schools weight. And so I think there needs to be attached some wording at the end of that sentence that acknowledges that there are also that other category of weights that have more to do with the district's characteristics than the individual student's characteristics. So those were the changes I had proposed.
So Iris, if we take that, so essentially we've got 3 sentences here.
Right.
And if you're right, if in that second sentence, if we did that further analysis relative to district size.
Well, there are other district ones too, weren't there? There was
there's a middle school.
Yeah, school size.
Middle.
That's not the individual student either. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
District size, not school size.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just needs to say something which it may be weighted for individual students whose needs exceed those of the average student to exceed of the average student, and may be weighted for district characteristics or whatever. I don't know, but somehow acknowledge that there are other kinds of weights.
Yep.
I mean, I wouldn't want to specify what they were, because then every time you want to change something, you got to change that. But just that there are 2 categories.
That's fair. I think that's consistent with the report.
That's all I had to offer.
Anybody else wishing to comment on this? I think this is, again, trying to come to the language currently in 2B. Which, currently says,
A reminder that people can find that language real quickly here on the link on the agenda if they want to go back to current 2B.
So where, Jay,
yes.
where Iris modified the word needs by putting educational in front of it, I was just wondering what sort of impact that might have on how this is read.
Well, I thought you better have education in front of needs, or you would assuming all of the students' needs. I mean, they have socioeconomic needs. You're not trying to meet those.
No, but there's health, there's
I
access.
wouldn't say you're trying to meet the health needs of all students. That's a whole nother ball of wax.
Comparable opportunity for an adequate education.
You're meeting their educational needs.
No, but this is regardless of the needs.
We would say student need. I mean, the AIR report uses student needs.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I view those health needs as being educationally related. In fact, they have to be educationally related, don't they, in order to be covered? I don't know. I just thought it needed some qualification, or it was way too broad.
And do you feel comfortable in grounding it in student needs? It is what's in the report. I mean, these are the two variables that they're using.
I mean, I think, doesn't this sort of relate back to, the idea of faith as well? So.
Yeah, I mean, then it's the child's role as a student that you're meeting. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, student is better than nothing. I think that, yeah, I can go with student instead of educational, but I think I need something.
Yeah, good. All right. Bruce, I think let's see what, and I think for all students, I think we're missing a TO too on the second line at the end, just before have. Yeah. Okay. Trying to look back at everybody else's face. How quizzical are we? Yeah, Val.
Yeah, so the reference here to the education cost model, is that the AIR model, or what is that specifically? It could be an input model. So I don't know what that's referring to.
So you would like, I mean, without necessarily, I want to catch the meaning of it. You feel like we ought to apply something like an outcomes-based model.
If that's what, our suggestion is, otherwise an education cost model could equal the existing input model, in which case there would be no change in how things are done. We just go through it again.
But I think it covers the beginning of the next sentence, the cost necessary to achieve a target outcome.
Well, I would think there are people who could argue that an input model would do the same.
Well, I guess we're accepting this as a term of art, education cost model, it's not AAR's term, it's a term in the field that focuses on outcomes. What does it cost to achieve a certain kind of education? So that's back in the earlier briefs that AAR provided for us about what it means to use a cost model.
Could you put a parenthetical there, though, Bruce, just so that we don't lose that thought about outcomes-based?
Say that again?
This thought that an ECM is not clear enough to define an outcomes-based model. So I think just put outcomes-based there so we know we need to come back and grapple with. Okay. What I like about this, whether this is statutory language or not, is that it's an effort to define what we've done.
Yes.
And if this is what we are recommending be in place for a 5-year period before it's reevaluated, that at least we come closer to what it's defined as. We can always come back to this and ask Bruce to bring it back up. Bruce, I think it's worth running through Bill's effort to give us some draft language, just to see the contrast in some of the other sections to existing statute.
That's here.
Yeah. So one of the things that I observed, and he's footnoted, but so much better. You can read that chart. So,
Sorry. Let me get it back up. Make it bigger. There we go.
all right. These first two sections, so 193 as a chapter of law, 193E, begins with findings and purpose. And again, so the first two sections, these are exactly the way that they are in the statute. What Bill then tries to do is describe some other transitions that lead to the outcomes-based approach.
Actually,
we could start picking this apart, and say, yeah, but I don't want to get into. I think we've got this document, and I more wanted us to see, where he's going in section 3. Maybe just go up for a second there, Bruce. Yeah, that just as we can see, section 3 begins. No, Roman,
Where'd you want to go?
Roman 3 and 1.
Wrong.
Yeah. So he begins to define the relationship between educational outcomes and total spending. He tries to make the transition to defining a concept of adequate education in terms of outcomes. This relationship, much like what Iris was just asking us to do, is what are those relationships to student needs, and that there as well. Again, maybe there are too many words in there, but I think the process that he's trying to go through is valuable. And whether 5 and 6 say the same thing, which I thought they did, but it could be, those could be,
Five.
they could be combined.
Well, 5 and 6 talk about concentrations, and it's kind of strange in a scheme that has no concentrations.
Because it is using the linear numbers.
Right. Remember the memo that Drew and Jesse prepared about.
That's what I'm saying, is that they rejected the idea of percentages being important, and yet here we have 2 paragraphs talking about how percentages are important.
But it's only in a linear way, not a curvilinear way. So it's still relevant.
Mm-hmm. Jay?
Yes, Dick.
You said at the top of this list, numerically listed set of paragraphs, that the first 2 were the same as the current statute. There's a significant change in one. The current statute near the end, where it says now and in the years to come, and what you're looking at, it does not have that regardless of where the students live, and instead it has an education that is consistent with the minimum standards for public school approval, the state established academic standards, and school district or school curriculum. So, in Bill's absence, this is a little hard to have this conversation, but
I agree. But I on the other hand, I don't want to leave this conversation without at least pointing out that we have some other good thought that's been applied, and we don't want to just leave the conversation about tweaking one section of the statute without giving consideration to the fact that there is a purpose clause to this chapter.
Yep.
But thank you.
Along those lines, Jay, I think we all should understand that that the companion piece to the section that we were looking at, which is what, 2B, is the section that's in the statutes now that is 19840A, the cost of an opportunity for an adequate education. And that's where the numbers come in that gives meat to the 2B reference point. It says the legislature shall use a education cost model, I'll use that phrase, in what we've just been looking at. That's the proposal. But then the legislature has to do that in order for it to become real. And that doing of the promise is in the Adequate Education Trust Fund part of the statute, which is a different part. And in that part, it currently has, the costs that we've been talking about, the weights that are currently in place, and the base cost that's currently in place, which would be swept away, and we'd have something new that fit this sort of general promise that, or commitment to do everything in accordance with an educational cost model. Then we make it specific in that follow-up section. It's got to be there because otherwise it's just words.
I understand what you're saying. They are, this merely defines a goal and the actualizing of that goal does occur in 19840.
Yeah, and don't misunderstand it. I mean, we don't have to do that second part now. It's just there is a necessary second piece.
Yep, that's a good point. Okay, if we get through this, note the changes in purpose, and thank you, Dick, for pointing that out. We'll need to highlight what those changes are in 1 and 2. Then it's clear that from 3 on down, these are all additions.
Hey, Jay,
yeah.
Without mentioning one of the minimum standards for public school approval and the established academic standards, which is also referenced later in this same section of law, and it defines what an academic standard is. And these standards are also referenced in some of the constitutional court cases which we've had. I don't know why he's taking the rest of that sentence in number 1 and just deleting it. It certainly gives cause from there to reference other layers within our statutes. This is really creating a huge void when you don't even mention the minimum standards for public school approval, which are then approved by GELCAR, but they are not certainly approved by the legislature as a whole. So I don't know. I think that the first paragraph was pretty well constructed years ago, back in what, 2007?
Yeah. And
modified in 16.
Yeah. So good point, Rick. And we need to make note of what's been deleted and what's been added.
Yeah, he has it in 2, but not in 1. He's deleted from 1.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and be consistent with minimum standards.
Yeah.
For public school approval, state academic standards, and most importantly, to your points, or at least to where we maybe to school district and school curriculum. And the point being that it allows for the fact that what is covered in the goals of public elementary, secondary schools are defined at the local level.
Yeah, and then in that Roman 2, we've had discussion today where we got to get away from just always talking adequate education, but the opportunity for an adequate education. In line 2 there,
yeah,
you could stick in provide an opportunity for adequate education through an integrated system.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, this is Barbara's point.
Yeah.
That we are lacking consistency of having opportunity identified. Bruce, for sake of capturing Dick's comments, could you go into 1 and just put a bracket around regardless of where students live, so we know that that's, yeah, we're bold it, do whatever, but yeah, thanks. We know we need to consider reinserting what was taken out and then consider what's been added. Thanks.
Bruce, I'm impressed.
Yeah. Your thumbs never would have gotten it on the first try, huh?
No way.
Yeah. All right. Can we get past this first E1, and then we can see that what E2, I believe, this is replicating what E2 currently is, which is the the general objectives of an adequate education. So we can't skip to 2E without seeing that we do include wellness, we do include the arts, we do include this career skills for lifelong learning and effective participation in our society. So these are broadly considered here in 2. And I don't think he meant to leave out 2A. I don't think that would be what we want to. So I think maybe Bruce, if you can just flag that at the end of 2, at the end of Roman 7, we need to be sure that there's consideration given to 2A, E2A.
You know, in Roman 2, in this section you're looking at, he has skill in mathematics. I think it's skill and knowledge. You know.
Well, right now, the language is just skill.
Yeah, I think it should be skill and knowledge in mathematics and familiarity with methods of science. If you don't have the knowledge, you can have the skill in applying, but you know, we've gone from just basic memorization to now trying to get kids to understand what it can be used for or towards. I don't know, knowledge to me is very important. Have a knowledge of the background, how it's used.
So if Jay, if I could suggest something here.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that's a good point that Rick is bringing up, but it's these common points that have been in our statute that resulted in the outcomes and resulted in the associated cost of an opportunity for adequate education that we're working with. So I'm just hesitant to change too much on this part, even as much as what Rick says makes sense, just to be consistent with the performance that and the costs that this has led us to.
So maybe we can just note a question of the value of retaining existing language for section 2.
Yeah. Particularly when it enumerates things like this, what goes into an adequate education.
Yeah.
Or what an adequate education shall provide all students with, yeah.
So, and then we got a note 2A, and then what we did, yep. All right, you got the 2A comment, and then we just talked about 2B, which, you know, we broke down into its pieces. So I think you could also say insert E2B per work group.
Well, actually, Jay, I think Bill's 2E3 and 4.
They are 2B. Yeah,
Exactly.
I agree. They are. You're right. Yes.
Somewhat longer.
Yeah, indeed. I agree. That it does seem that E3 is his 2B.
And 4, I think.
And let's see. Okay, I agree.
So for this document, we don't need to insert.
No, I think what we would be doing really, and you know, legislators here recognize that there's often when these extensions wind up being a B and then a dot I and a dot 2I, and you know, that's I think what his 3 and 4 would likely
Jay, on Romans 7, that's the one that's on my screen right now at the top there, skills for lifelong learning.
Yeah.
If you were to talk to the guys in the vocational centers again, or CTEs, one of the most important things is a student learning how to communicate. And so where you say learn, work, communicate, and participate effectively in a changing society. If they can't communicate, then we've lost it. So on number 7, right after the comma, right after work, I put in another word in there and I put communicate.
Yep. Okay.
Rick, is that not handled in Roman 1 here at the top?
In Roman 1, well, if you're looking at that,
I know it. And Val might even weigh. I mean, we've got David's comment, maybe leave well enough alone in this section. On the other hand,
It's really not part of what we're supposed to be doing.
but we can note that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely.
That after work we put communicate, and I think Val, from his BIA hat, and I've heard that argument before.
Yes.
And right at the top of that whole section, starting with Roman 1, where it says, an adequate education shall provide all students with the opportunity to acquire and apply. Now, to acquire it, but can you use it? And so what we're trying to do in most of our language is also apply these skills 1 through 7 down below. So you want to have acquire and apply to use.
Good points, Rick. Good points. Which is why when you started to rewrite on this is the section you were rewriting.
Yeah, and I can bring apply in there, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I tried like the devil to get something referencing engineering challenges in here. I'm trying to protect the CTEs.
Yeah. So I don't know that we need to go on with this any further. I think this was valuable. We know that we've got to review this document and have some broader conversation. Hopefully this is Bruce and David. Hopefully we've given some input to how to tee up a broader commission conversation about these topics. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah,
back to our agenda. I'm going to try to help us cover a couple of other topics to see if we can make any further progress.
So Jay, I want to put one more thing out there because I think you may have missed it at the end of the public engagement work group.
I did.
But Mel may be begging off on a couple of work group days, depending upon what their workload is. And I was thinking you and I might want to take that 1 p.m. time slot as a joint fiscal adequacy work session to as we see fit, just to use it as we see fit.
Okay, good.
So that could be 2 weeks from today.
Good repositioning. Thanks. Okay, we've now, at 3:45, we were to have a conversation on transportation as included or separate from the base adequacy formula. If we could take 15 minutes on this, and then we can see about some of the other questions that were teed up in this agenda. But you know, Rick, he's near.
He must have smelled apple pie.
I admit I had a couple of different apple bakeries this weekend. This is the season. Does anyone else? So I've got a position on this that I feel I wanted to express. are there others that have positions on whether to include transportation or not? In the adequacy
I have a question
cost
about
estimation model. I'm sorry?
I have a question about it.
Yep.
I listened to part of the court argument the other day once I could get them. And I think it was the plaintiff attorney talked about how outrageous it was the transportation wasn't included and made a big point about high school transportation not being included. But is it still in statute that high school transportation is not required?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a rationale for which you wouldn't include it in adequacy if it's not even included in the standards. But doesn't mean I favor that. I just wondered for clarification, given it was brought up in the court argument. Thanks.
Sure. I think that's in 189. District's responsibilities.
I thought the current model had a $300 as part of the blend for all.
It is, no.
No?
Well, it's in base adequacy, yes.
Yeah.
$300 and something, $315.
Yeah.
But it's not for every student, is it?
Yes, it
Yeah.
is.
Because it's the number only applies to the ADMA.
That's the conflict we have.
Yeah.
We're doing
It's a
it
blend.
in adequacy, but we're not saying it in statute elsewhere to support what we're doing.
Rick, what we're trying to tee up with this question is, as you know, we've got in the AIR considered two different approaches to the estimated cost model. One included the cost of transportation as a part of overall spending, and another deleted it. So if one looks at that difference in the base amount per student, it's either $5,000, $4,990, or $5,800. So there's like a $900 difference in times 168,000 students, and you wind up with about $140 million of the total amount distributed for the opportunity of an equal for an adequate education. The question is, do we pull that out of the overall model where it is distributed as a part of base adequacy, you might say, and or do we leave it in? And I know you've got some strong feelings, as you should, being in part of the state where the distances between schools and students served by those districts is far different from more concentrated areas. Oops, I used the word. But my concern is that once we start pulling out categories from the overall spending, that there almost is no end to it. And then it becomes subject to pulling it apart, meaning is $140 million too much for the state to be spending on transportation, or too little? It becomes its own separate argument. And I think that once you start doing that, it suggests that, oh, well, there are other costs maybe in that 2.9, nearly $3 billion that is a part of the model that can be taken out. And I don't think that that's true nor good to do as we make the transition. I don't disagree with, there's an argument to be made to pull out transportation. I just feel that the timing of when it's done affects how well we can explain the total spending model.
Yes, there's merit to what you're saying, Jay. One, the Department of Education has very little information on actual transportation costs, other than what you see on DOE 25 form, which the schools put together. I do believe in the long run that there are several areas which really should be their own categorical funding. And because there's some really unique needs to transportation too. Most of the states which have this type of separate funding, it's based on linear density. It's based upon number of students living in a certain area. But you also have a breakdown too on their scale of how they allocate funds out for special services, special education, which that becomes it's an easier way to see the money that's going towards that end, and it's not buried within some kind of a grand formula. I think it's important that we fund our special education transportation costs. This is one way of doing it, but also the transportation costs that I would fund are not the transportation costs that maybe you're looking at in terms of just having the outcome and taking your DOE 25 costs. There's some costs in there which I feel have, they're enriching adequacy, maybe through a field trip. However, I don't think it's absolutely necessary for that costing of an adequate education. You mean when I send kids down to watch the Red Sox play baseball in Boston and on a field trip, is that something I'm going to have the state reimbursing me for? Well, you know, I don't think we should, but that could be a legitimate field trip. So I'd like to see the separate categorical areas saying it is for transportation to and from school and for all special education needs, and work at that out. We need to transition into that, Jay. We're not ready to go there. We need to mimic what they're doing with highway block monies, what DOT is doing. That's how they provide the money to the individual municipalities right now. They know the linear density of every road in this state by classes, class 1 through class 6 roads. So I think we need to move there. I don't think we're ready to do it. I think we need to really craft some formula or look at some kind of committee looking at this and really redefining how we're doing it. It's not working right now, where we have declining enrollments in these communities and we're funding it on a per capita basis. It's just not enough to roll a bus even anymore and pay all those costs of insurance, Primex and labor and new buses. It just doesn't make it.
So if I can try to ask Bruce and David, we've, in this group, we've examined a number of categories without using the word categorical funding, but we've looked at a number of categories that we've lacked the data to proceed with pulling apart elements of the cost of the total spending. So we need more data. We've said that on special education. I think Rick's pointing out maybe we need a commission or something that will lead us to methodology on transportation. We had a similar conversation on early childhood. We had a similar conversation I think we could frame around career technical education and broadening the opportunities, as both Rick and Val have said, beyond just where the career technical centers are located, to spreading that out more to all schools in the state. So I think we need some kind of vision for not losing the thread of a conversation on transportation, but you know, the framework for how we're going to include a need to carry on that inquiry. This formula isn't perfect. It's a great transition, and there are obviously improvements that could be made along the way, but that we need more data to do it.
So I can see in the report, our final report, a specific section addressing categorical aid, including early childhood, CTE, and then again, transportation, depending on where we land with transportation. Just a reminder that the AAR base amount for students before any differentiated aid is added now has $900 per pupil for transportation. That's the differential between those two numbers. So that's just putting that back out, FYI.
But it's actual. It's an actual spend.
Yes.
Iris?
Yeah, I want to muddy the water a little more. I'm wondering, our charter schools, we continually refer to them as public schools. Are the students attending them entitled to the opportunity for an adequate education? And if transportation is part of that, they need to start offering transportation. This is one of the features of charter schools that's always gotten my craws, that you have access as long as you can get yourself there, as their advocate said. And that eliminates the opportunity for a lot of students. So it's sort of the same thing with our VOC-TEC problem, but much smaller scale, obviously. But nonetheless, it's a point that needs to be thought about in terms of whether transportation is in or out, if those students are entitled to the opportunity for an adequate education. Otherwise, I sort of favor having it in, just because I think every time you take something out, you start putting it up for cutting.
You're right about reminding us about charter schools. We did have a conversation with them about the $11,000 average spending in charter schools, but they don't include certain costs, which Jane has pointed out for us, do get shifted back to the school districts. Anyway, it's another one of those sections that I think we need to probably, it'd be worth noting where some of the intersections are with our adequate education model.
Jay, on the current estimated cost model, where you've got an option to either include or exclude transportation, when transportation is excluded, where is special education transportation?
Yeah, I think I've heard, Jane, yours were probably listening closely. I've heard them say that those are a part of the overall transportation cost.
Okay, so when transportation's out of the cost model, that includes special education, CTE, home to school.
Doesn't include. I think I heard him say that it does include CTE, which raised a question mark for me.
CTE transportation.
Yeah, but
It's separately funded.
I know that. I know it's separately funded. So we need to check on that, because
Okay.
I don't want to misstate it. But
all right. Yeah. So that's yeah. So we should and Rick, if you've got some just enumerating all the different possible transportation categories and making sure we understand which ones are in or which ones are out when that binary switch is set on the ECM.
I can get that information very quickly for you. I just don't want to leave something out.
Yeah, right. We just need to know where it is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
understand.
Looks like Jordan's got his finger on them.
Just a small clarification that may help for folks more in the know. But I remember talking to AIR and them saying that they did it based on DOE 25 classifications. So to the extent that special education transportation is captured in the special education lines, it would fall under the special education weight.
Right.
To the extent that it falls under transportation, it would be in the transportation weight. And I'm not familiar enough with the specifics to exactly know, but if folks do, that's my understanding of how those are conceptualized into the model.
Great. Thanks for recalling Drew's feedback. Okay, with a couple minutes left, I think we can move past transportation. On the agenda, we had concentration factors, and Iris, I want to make sure that if there's more that you would like to add to where AIR's memo led us. And we do have a couple page memo. It's not too long. I think it's 3 pages, 2.5. They said that if there was a reason for concentrations, that it would show up in a curvilinear model. They looked to see if that curvilinear model had high predictability. They found that it did not, and that really there was more correlation with linear factors as opposed to trying to do something that would concentrate and say that there should be a higher weight on certain ends of the extreme.
I was interested in doing both, but yeah, I yield to this statistical analysis, though my gut and my experience tells me otherwise.
Yeah.
I yield.
Thank you. Thanks. And you know, I think to the model's credit, where there is higher concentration, there's higher valuation, and so that's why the higher correlation. So other outstanding issues. Let's talk about the debt service just for a moment so that we're at least clear on this. I know that we've asked AIR and Drew a couple of times about debt service, and Jordan, as our record keeper, I'm going to rely on your fact keeping. But I believe what they've said to us is that debt service just isn't included in the $2.94 billion, right?
That's my understanding as well, because it's a very sort of individualistic item.
Yeah,
So
we should double check.
Yeah, and I think we have, and I believe that's the answer that we've gotten a couple of times. As we write this up, we'll certainly do all of our fact checking through back with them. But I think what this leaves us with is that as another section that we need to comment on is capital spending, because in fact there is no capital spending unless it's through an operating budget that's included in the model. Which means that the $80 million that was discussed with us, the annual investment, is outside the model, whether it's locally invested or state invested.
Wouldn't that also be somewhat tied with a building aid or building grant program,
Yes.
and certainly related to debt service? And different districts may want to take different approaches to debt service as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And it leaves it as a categorical funding
Mhm.
for the state to determine.
Is the fiscal committee going to talk about whether this commission makes any statement about school building aid being strengthened?
I hope we are going to gonna do that. That's something that I think does fall within our scope, and I know Rick and I have worked on a number of things for building aid, and it's something that if we're looking to budget it at a certain number, we're going to have to figure out where that comes from and whether that comes from something that we would otherwise put in the education trust fund. We just need to account for it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because, I said it way earlier in our conversations, but I think that a lot of our kids are learning in really substandard physical conditions, unhealthy conditions,
Mhm.
conditions in which you or I would find it hard to concentrate and work in. And I think that we need to make a strong statement about that and do something about it.
The way we're doing it right now is that we have this legislation that we can fund up to $50 million per year. We are only funding the tail plus a few extra bucks to do 1 or 2 or 3 projects like we did this last year. I think that's around $8 million, wasn't it, Jay, that beyond the paying off the tail. I introduce every session a bill that says we will fund building aid at no less than $50 million. But I think that there's a real need to hit on this one, seeing that we have so many of our buildings, which, as Iris just said, that are old and not able to provide the quality education that we consider adequate. And so we got to look at that. One way of looking at it, I don't know if Dick's talked about this, but I've heard it from several people that, like Mike Cahill, that we're now funding projects at 80% upfront, and saving the district from all the interest rates. They're getting this, so they're only having to cough up. The 20% is coughed up upon completion of the project, so they really don't have to worry about borrowing a whole lot of money. But if we were to fund them, let's say the way we used to, it's up to the district to pay the interest on what they're borrowing to complete the project. So there's several things we can look at besides just saying we want to fund no less than 50 million. Now, how much are we going to pay up front? We would be shifting part of that burden back to the towns, though, on the interest.
So
I think we should look at it from an outcome perspective. Let's assess what the needs are out there, which it's easy to do. The DOE has that information.
They have a survey.
And they create a plan to ameliorate it.
right, and doing so at 3 projects a year, we're never going to get through that list. That's the thing. So right now, bonds are a really good deal, and I would definitely support increasing the funding. But don't pay 80% up front. Pay it out over a 20-year period. Let them bond it. In the past, the support was enough to cover the interest payment and a little bit more, but that was when bonds were a lot higher than whatever they are right now. But I'd be very supportive in seeing the state be able to award more projects every year than it can with the 80%.
Well, you got to remember too, though, Dave, when I came into the legislature back 12 years ago, we had a huge building aid debt. It was like close to $500 million in debt that we owed. And of course, the state is only allowed to bond so much. I think, what is it, up to 200 million?
Yeah, that's because the state bonded a few years of building aid, right?
Yeah.
And then made it illegal to do that anymore.
But we
so.
can't go any higher than that. So
Yeah.
we're kind of
Yeah.
captured by that. The best thing that's happening is the tail is getting smaller each year, and we will have more funds to, we could introduce a bill where we appropriate $50 million on top of what we owe on the tail. That would be somewhere around probably $75 million.
Right, right. But, from what you just said, Rick, all the more reasons to let the districts use their credit worthiness, their credit ratings to be able to bond.
Yeah, but remember, they have to get these things approved locally, like Lebanon, when they went for the middle school. How many tries at a bond did it take to get that passed? I think 3 or 4.
Yeah.
When you set this up so you're going to get 80% up front, the chances of getting the bond through are much better than you're only going to get 20%. Then you're having to cough up more from the locals, and that's another reason why the things get voted down.
I'm not sure we need to endorse a method of addressing it, but I think it would be good for us to put in a statement of the need, and based on what DOE knows, and then push for a solution to be adopted that invests more than $50 million a year, so that we get to the target quicker, because the conditions, as this statement would reveal, are pretty deplorable.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, it's been proven the achievement scores in a school district where they have a brand new facility and a new, clean, neat, and up-to-date materials within it, their achievement scores are going to be above those by a good 15, 20%, because students see it and they react to it. So does staff. So does everybody working and walking into that building. So we do know, and the Department of Education, the director over there has this information available on the increased achievement scores, how the HVAC can make huge differences in terms of health and welfare and wellness. So I think that we could actually get some of the comments from the department to write into a report saying, for these reasons, we need to support additional funds being put into building aid for the municipalities.
So Rick, the department did provide us, I think, with their most recent building survey.
Yeah.
And that is on the commission website.
Yeah.
Yes, it's on our commission's website, right?
Yes, our commission.
She gave us two reports, and that's why I say the $85 million a year was her target to get to over, I think, a 35-year period to the $2 billion worth of investment that the state needs to make. So I think she gave us a methodology. I think I like where Iris's suggestion about this, that we don't, much like what we're doing with the overall cost estimation model, is we're not recommending a dollar amount. We're just recommending an approach. And I think we can do that with the information that we got. We don't need to say it needs to be 50 million or 85, but we can say we know that over a 35-year period, here's the amount that the state would need to invest, or $85 million a year would get us to that target.
Some statement about health and safety being part of an adequate education, or the opportunity for an adequate education, especially in this era of COVID. I mean, back when I was with one of you, I tried to get through a bill to make schools have to meet indoor air quality standards. Well, we couldn't do that because who's going to pay for all the repairs, was the response. Yeah. So along comes COVID and we don't have healthy air in our schools, a lot of them. So, to me, that'd be one place to start looking at where we need to invest some capital dollars.
Absolutely. Thanks for the comment. We actually had the bill we just we didn't move it this year.
One other thing, Jay, we have the similar problem with the CTE. We're getting to the point we're going to start going through that rotation again.
Yeah.
And buildings are not getting cheaper. and the equipment in these buildings is not getting any cheaper. Are we going to just play the same game for the next, 25 years?
Right, and you're on that advisory council,
Well,
right?
Val is too. Val's
Yeah, right. And we heard from Eric Froworth the alternative to that, which is take that amount and annually allocate it, but not to a single facility. Try and spread that $20 million across all 28 or all 80 districts. I mean, it just, right?
Look what Delaware is doing with a similar amount of students. And Val mentioned that at a preceding meeting. We're being shamed by a little state like Delaware.
Yeah.
Yeah, we spend 9 million and they spend 90.
Yeah. And they have a 70% participation rate, and we've got a less than 10.
Yep.
We're at 5 o'clock. The last item on the agenda is that work group meetings are going to be scheduled through October and November. I assume at the next commission meeting, that schedule is going to be distributed to us. But I think that it's safe to say, retain time on every Monday's schedule for either a full commission or a work group meeting. And David, like you said, we may be meeting jointly with the fiscal committee. And
Yeah, and you mentioned that 2 weeks from today. Did you mean today being a Tuesday, or did you
I
mean
meant today being Monday. So,
Okay, because that is
Yeah.
Columbus Day, if you consider that a holiday.
So maybe it is the Tuesday, because we talked about that. Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
I do
So it is.
want Tuesday, so that's what I wondered. Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, and I thought it was interesting
Can't
this
do it.
morning because a lot of our fiscal policy discussion was revolving around adequacy. And Jay, a lot of your work group discussion this afternoon revolved around fiscal policy. So so I think we're feeling what Bill Ardinger described as the Chinese finger trap. So we're both sort of snarled in with each other right now. So having some overlap on some weeks will be really good.
yeah, thanks. So Iris, did I hear that you're not available on that 13th?
Not till probably 1:30 at least, but I'll join you when I can. But
Okay.
I was just not sure whether we had to acknowledge Columbus Day as a holiday. It's a little controversial.
Indigenous Peoples Day.
I've got both holidays on my calendar, so I'm not sure which one we're honoring, but let's say that we're honoring both. And indeed, we'll meet on the 13th, and we'll try and structure our meetings to be at 1:30 or later. Okay, if nothing else for us today, hopefully we've given some fodder for the full commission conversation next Monday. Thank you all. Motion to adjourn.
Thanks, everyone. Be well. Enjoy the rain.
Yeah.
It's here. It's coming.
Green.